You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions.
You're listening to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Paul Bestel. On today's show, we head to Texas in November 1957 to look at a remarkable UFO case that seems to show us the lengths that the US Air Force and the authorities would go to in regards to suppressing sightings and witnesses. Numerous witnesses, machinery that stopped working, landing sites, and much more didn't seem to matter to Project Blue Book or the Condon Report. Shedding a light on this murky mystery of late 50s ufology is esteemed ufologist Kevin Randle. He takes us through the evidence to leave us in no doubt that something odd was certainly going on over those 3 days in November. We also discuss the Socorro incident and his upcoming book on Roswell as it approaches its 75th anniversary. But before we get to the interview, as always, you can support Mysteries and Monsters by signing up via patreon.com/Mysteries and Monsters. A big thank you to my latest patron, Leandra. And you too, for $4 a month, get ad-free episodes, early releases, bonus content, and more. You can also click on the Patreon link in the show notes as always. You can also find Mysteries and Monsters across all social media platforms: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And don't forget you can subscribe to our YouTube channel by searching for Mysteries and Monsters. You can also find the mysteriesandmonsters.com website where you can find your merchandise and more. As always, thank you to Dean Bestel for his marvellous artwork. The show is produced by Brennan Storr of the Ghost Story Guys, and Mysteries and Monsters is delighted to be a part of the Straight Up Strange network. Don't forget, as I mentioned on the last intro, Dr. Rob Gandy, friend of the show, with his 2 appearances, is doing a talk this week. So if you want to check him out and try and get to Scunthorpe to hear some spooky stories, which might kind of put you off driving home, then you can check the link in the show notes to get tickets for his talk. Now, something very strange was going on during 3 nights in November, so let's dive into the Levelland incident with the marvellous Kevin Randle. Today, we return to the topic of ufology. It's 1957, and the city of Levelland, Texas, is about to find itself visited by something that saw multiple sightings and interactions. To discuss this case, I am delighted to welcome someone I have wanted to speak to for a long time, Mr. Kevin Randle. Kevin, welcome to Mysteries and Monsters.
I'm glad to be here.
Kevin, as I touched on there in the introduction, for me, you're one of those people in the UFO circle that I've always been deeply interested to hear what you are investigating or what you've been researching, be it through your books as a prolific author and investigator as you are, and from your numerous appearances on TV shows and podcasts around the world.
I was going to say, you make me sound very, very famous.
Well, I would suggest in certain circles you probably are, Kevin. So it's one of those things. I think often when you're in a certain niche subject, certain people tend to gravitate towards the top, and I would certainly put you in the higher echelons of the UFO researcher category, especially over the last 20 years and some of the excellent cases you've brought to light.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the kind words.
Oh, you're very welcome. I was delighted to see someone had dragged Levelland back into the modern era, Kevin, because in my brief knowledge of this case, I've often been struck at it being sort of a prime example of the establishment and USAF attempts to discredit and suppress UFO cases in the 1950s. And I think for me, Levelland is probably one of the best examples of the whole establishment machine working overtime to just basically shut something down.
I think in the same way that you do. I think of it as nearly as important as the Roswell case. Roswell, we have the crashed vehicle, which would prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that there's extraterrestrial visitation. But when we look to Levelland, we have, again, multiple witnesses. We have interaction with the environment. We have a series of sightings that go on for just a couple of hours, and we can see the level of the Air Force. I don't want to say incompetence of their investigation. I think it was a premeditated investigation so that they didn't come to a conclusion that would get everybody interested in UFOs or flying saucers again. But we can see the level of the cover-up as it takes place there as well. So I think it's a very important case, one of the most important cases. And I'm a little bit surprised that no one has really done a whole lot of research into it till this point.
Yeah, I find it very surprising as well, Kevin, because primarily we've got a lot of witnesses. It's touched on in Blue Book. J. Allen Hynek in the late 60s, when he'd sort of seen the light and come to the other side, often would say that it was one of the most frustrating cases when he looked back that he realised he'd swallowed the official line, hook, line and sinker. And he seemed rather annoyed about how he felt. I think he felt he'd probably been manipulated a bit to follow the party line.
When Hynek joined Blue Book, or joined Project Sign actually back in 1948 as a scientific consultant, because he was at the Ohio State University, and it always cracks me up, Ohio State University, it's the Ohio State, came on board as their scientific consultant. And I think that he came on board with the idea there is not a possibility of alien visitation, ergo there has to be a terrestrial explanation for all sightings. And I think he carried that sort of feeling through the middle of the 1960s. I think Socorro in 1964, the Lonnie Zamora sighting, I think began to make him question his position. And then when we get to the Michigan sightings of 1966, where he is kind of painted with the brush of the ultimate skeptic. He landed in Michigan to look at the sightings, and the newsman said, well, what do you think? And he says, well, it sounds like swamp gas to me, without having looked at it. And I think it was just an off-the-cuff remark. And if you look at the preliminaries that came through in Michigan, it does sound like swamp gas. But the news media, being the news media, accepted that as the official pronouncement. This is it. It's swamp gas. And that was the end of it. And it kind of soured him, I think, on his relation with the military, although it had been sort of contentious between him and Hector Quintanilla, who was the chief of Project Blue Book in the 1960s. They had a very adversarial relationship, and I think all these things kind of turned him around, so he realized that they had kind of blown the investigations, or many of the investigations, by looking at it strictly through the lens of it cannot be, therefore it is not. And I think that he realized that there was much more to this. And I think Levelland's a perfect example of it. And we'll get into the detail, I'm sure. But the official explanation was ball lightning. And in 1957, there was an argument in the scientific community of whether ball lightning existed. I think in today's environment, there's still a bit of an argument about the existence of ball lightning, although there is some evidence that that kind of phenomenon exists, but it's extremely rare. And the problem here is ball lightning has a life of 2 or 3 seconds, maybe. It's very short-lived, and it's never bigger than 18 inches or 2 feet in diameter. And we're talking about, in Levelland, a craft that was in the area for 2.5 hours that was much larger than 2 feet in diameter and interacting with the environment. And I know of no case where ball lightning is interacted in the environment the same way that this craft in Levelland interacted with the environment. So I think that kind of underscores the Air Force explanation, or the Air Force investigation, because they seized on that almost immediately, and they've stuck to it till today. You go back to the Project Blue Book files, the index, and it's still listed as ball lightning, and it's a preposterous explanation.
Yes, absolutely. As you touched on there, Kevin, the Zamora incident as well. I saw a documentary recently where they were looking at that case, and they accepted the explanation that was given in Blue Book, because I believe the official explanation was that Zamora had stumbled across them testing a space unit, and what he was seeing was a lunar module prototype that was being suspended from a helicopter. But if you look at what Zamora reports, I find it very hard to believe that a police officer wouldn't spot a helicopter sort of 20 foot above something holding on to it.
Well, the problem is they weren't testing the lunar lander in New Mexico at that specific time. And so they'd done some testing earlier in the day, but nothing that was going on at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And second of all, the Air Force explanation for that, unbelievably, is unidentified. Again, you go to the Project Blue Book files, and it's listed as an unidentified sighting. And if you read Hector Quintanella's memoirs, an unpublished manuscript about his time with Project Blue Book, he mentions in there that he could find no explanation for it, and he knew that the UFO nuts would have a field day with this because he felt compelled to say it was unidentified. I'm not sure why he felt compelled that way, but you look at what he'd done. He'd been to Holloman Air Force Base, which is not that far from Socorro, and of course the White Sands Missile Range, which is where they were testing things like that, with his top secret clearance and a letter suggesting he had access to all the various projects going on there. I'm not sure how you can issue such a blanket statement in that arena at the top secret level, but he had the clearances to ask the proper questions, and he could not find any explanation for it. So the chief of Project Blue Book, even in his memoirs written years after he left Blue Book and the military, said that he had no explanation for it, which I think is incredible. The other thing important about the Socorro cases, for the longest time, I had said that it was a single witness. It was, a police officer, there were landing traces left behind and his observations of the craft. But when you get to it, you find out there's more to it. I was interviewing Ben Moss, and he'd said to me he said that some people had called into the police station in Socorro prior to Zamora seeing the object, hearing a roar in the sky and seeing a blue flame in the sky, this sort of thing. And I said to him a number of times, well, is that in the police log? Is that in the police log? And he never answered the question, which sparked my interest in it. And I looked through the Project Blue Book files, and there's a statement by Captain Richard Holder, who was assigned to the White Sands Missile Range, and his duty station was on the northern edge of the range. And so he lived in Socorro rather than Alamogordo because Socorro was much closer where he was pulling his duty. And he sent in a document that mentioned that when he interviewed Zamora and the police officers that very night of April 24th, 1964, he sent a report into the Pentagon saying that 3 people had called the police station. So we have it documented. It wasn't in the police blotter, but we have it documented. And of course, the policeman didn't bother to write down the names of these people hearing the roar of the craft. But now we have evidence that there were additional witnesses, not to mention the traveling couple that was stopped at Opal Grinder's gas station. When I say police station, gas station, on their way home, who never came forward, but Grinder had mentioned that they had talked about the low-flying craft and the roar and that sort of thing. So we had a number of witnesses there at the time. The Air Force, as I said, Quintanilla could not find an explanation for it. Hynek was there. There was an NICAP investigator there named Ray Stanford. The Lorenzens were there. And what I do not understand to this day is they had the information that there were additional witnesses. And I'm thinking we knew the path of the object. And although they didn't give their names to the police, it would be very easy to go into that area of Socorro, because Socorro wasn't that big in 1964, and knock on doors and ask people questions and gather that additional information. Nobody thought to do that. Hynek didn't think to do that. And I'm thinking as a scientific consultant, I'm not surprised. The Air Force NCO with him, whose name escapes me at the moment, didn't think of that, and it was his job. He was assigned to Blue Book to investigate these cases. He should have looked for those additional witnesses. Ray Stanford, who was the NICAP investigator there, he didn't think to do it. And the Lorenzens didn't think to do it. And I'm just astonished that nobody bothered to try to find those additional witnesses to that case. And it's inspired me to do a book called Encounter in the Desert, where I lay all this stuff out and some of that additional information that makes this case much stronger than I originally thought. It's not single witness. It's multiple witnesses with landing traces. And of course, they didn't do a good job of collecting samples. Hynek showed up, I think, according to Ray Stanford at least, Hynek showed up and didn't have anything to collect samples in. So Stanford loaned him some jars to collect samples from the landing site and that sort of thing. Photographs, we'd have photographs of the landing traces. One of the things they did the night of April 24th is they surrounded each of the landing pad marks with stones to kind of protect them. And 3 or 4 days later, those landing traces were still visible. And there's photographs of them. The Air Force took photographs of them. So we had an opportunity again there for a very strong case with a very good investigation, which would have changed the whole course of our conversation today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a lot of parallels with what happened at Levelland as well here, because as you refer to there, Kevin, there were people who were reporting this to the police, and the officer who took the calls just didn't think it was worthy jotting down. And we can see this in numerous UFO cases. This one is a prime example where the first person who's brave enough to call in, Paolo Saucedo, is sort of brushed off as being drunk or hallucinating by the officer and kind of thinks it's just a bit of a joke. And especially in that kind of era, I still find it remarkable that things are often dismissed as alcohol-induced hallucinations when the medical evidence will always suggest that that's next to impossible. People's perception can be altered, but not to the point where they're completely hallucinating, Kevin. And I think when you go back to the sort of 40s, 50s and 60s, this kind of explanation or excuse from official channels is prevalent in so many cases where people are often dismissed as being tipsy or just not understanding what they're saying. People are either drunk or stupid, it seems, Kevin.
That's correct. But the case actually starts a few hours earlier, prior to Pedro Saucedo, with a young couple near Amarillo, Texas. And if you look at the map, you'll see Amarillo up in the panhandle of Texas, and you go due south and you run into Lubbock, Texas. And 20 minutes west of Lubbock, you come to Levelland. So it's all in that panhandle area of Texas. And this young couple drove into a mist and their car engine stalled. And then the object took off and the mist dissipated, but they couldn't get the car started again because their battery was dead. Their battery was completely dead. They finally got into Amarillo and reported it to the police. They said, where do we go to report a flying saucer? And the police didn't even write their names down. We know about the case, but we don't know who they were because the police didn't take the, I guess, basic step of writing the names down of the witnesses. I can give you a description of what they look like, which is going to do us no good here in 2022. But the police actually sent somebody out along the highway to see if there was anything along there that would have caused their car to stall out or their battery to die completely, and didn't see anything. But that takes place in Amarillo. It's north of Levelland, and then we get to Pedro Saucedo. And you're absolutely right. The first reaction by the police when he called in was that he was drunk or it was some kind of joke and didn't bother with it. Pedro Saucedo talked about how he was driving along, I think it was Highway 114 at the time, heading toward the west which would have been from the Lubbock area toward Levelland, and came to this big blue object, kind of came down, stalled his pickup truck, I should say. He dived out and rolled underneath it for protection. Saucedo was not a World War II. He was a Korean War veteran. His passenger was so frightened, he's just sat there staring at it. The object finally turned to a bright red or a bright orange red and took off. And once it was gone, Saucedo could get his truck started again, and they were so frightened by the experience, they didn't continue to Levelland. They called it in, and of course the police blew it off because, flying saucer stalling your car. You what have you been drinking? But over the next 2.5 hours, they got numerous calls from people all around the Levelland area saying the same thing, reaching the point where the Sheriff Ware Clem, and I absolutely hate that name. I wish he had a good name like, Tom Baker. And I mentioned Tom Baker because he was Doctor Who at one point.
Yes, he was, yeah.
Or Jack Armstrong, something like that, a good name. But he decided he needed to go out and see what was happening. He went out in a police car, a patrol car, sheriff's car, with one of his deputies. Behind them was another car with the Texas State Police. And I think the name of them at the time was the Texas Department of Public Safety. I think that's still the name today, and I don't know when they changed the name, but I think it was still the Texas Department of Public Safety. And behind them, according to some of the documentation I found, was another car with Air Force officers in it. And the sheriff was interviewed the next day or the day after and talked about seeing this oval-shaped, brightly glowing red object. Then the following day, which works out to, I think, November 5th, an Air Force NCO from Air Force Base in Colorado Springs went down to investigate the case in Levelland, spent a whole 7 hours there, talked to 6 people. According to the statement that the sheriff gave to that Air Force NCO, his name was Norman Barth, by the way, he just saw a streak of light in the distance. Some years later, after the sheriff was no longer the sheriff, he was interviewed by a guy named Don Berliner, and he told Berliner, yeah, I saw this oval-shaped, brightly glowing object. So the sheriff got close enough to see an object rather than a streak of light, as did the police officers in the car behind him, as did the Air Force officers in the third car. Don Burlinson, yes, it's another Don. There's a lot of Dons in this conversation. We get 2 or 3 more coming up here in the future. Yeah. Did a investigation around the turn of the century, around 2000, and he interviewed the widow of the sheriff and the sheriff's daughter. And they talked about how the sheriff had gotten much closer, which we knew because we had the evidence from the sheriff both before and after the Air Force investigation. Burlinson also talked to the guy who was the mechanic for the sheriff's office at the time, and he said, yes, the sheriff brought the car in the next day to have it looked at. And I'm thinking, and I point this out in the book, why would the sheriff do that? And the only explanation for that is his car stalled. And he wanted to see if there was a mechanical reason for the car stalling. And, of course, there wasn't, other than the close approach of the UFO. So what that really tells us is we had 3 cars of law enforcement and military officers who got close enough to the object for their engines to stall. We have an Air Force investigation that lasted 7 hours. And I'm not sure what Barth did for those 7 hours because he didn't do a lot of investigating. He only talked to, I think, 6 people, including the sheriff. Didn't talk to all the witnesses that were available to him. Failed to do that. And then he left. And so what we're left with is an investigation that reeks of incompetence. And I can't believe incompetence is the answer. But we also know that Barth would have talked to those Air Force officers who had their cars stalled when they were driving out there with the sheriff. I mean, that makes sense. He knows about the sheriff. He's going to know about the convoy, the mini convoy, as I call it, with these other cars stalling out, and it involved Air Force officers. And there is not a word I can find about the interrogation of those Air Force officers to their sighting in the official files or anywhere else. So the question becomes, who talked to them? What did they learn from those Air Force officers, and where did those reports go? The only thing I have been able to find is a couple of newspaper clippings that talked about this convoy with the 3-car convoy with the Air Force officers participating in it. They would have come from Reese Air Force Base, which is in Lubbock, and it's about 20 minutes away from Levelland. So we know that. Then we've got all these other people involved. There's people, I always say 13 people, witnesses at 13 separate locations, independently reporting this in. The sheriff is quoted as saying a couple of times there were actually a couple of dozen phone calls they got, maybe as many as 100 phone calls about this thing in the area, stalling their car engines, which inspired them to go out. But once Saucedo had made his report, then others began calling in. They suddenly realized something's going on here, and what is it? And that was what inspired the sheriff to go out and look.
Yeah, I think it's remarkable when you're reading your sort of overview of this case, Kevin. One of the things that I find incredible is that there seems to be no interview with Saucedo's passenger. I think you refer to that there's no direct quotes from this chap. I believe his name was Salas.
Yes.
And he was apparently paraphrased later on, saying that what he'd seen and the fact that it was too bright for him to really stare at for long, and it happened for more than a few seconds. It was something that went on for quite a while. He was clear what he could see. Obviously, Paolo was brave enough to get out, and he was saying it was so hot he had to throw himself to the ground because he was so frightened by what might happen. And yet, I find it incredible. We've got one eyewitness who's brave enough to phone the police and is brushed off. The other guy, as we've touched on in some other aspects of other famous cases, Kevin, I can't believe that there's no official statement from this chap as a key eyewitness.
My point exactly. The only person that apparently talked to him, well, there was a NICAP investigator who talked to a number of the witnesses and prepared a report for NICAP, which is the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. And you have to remember it is a civilian organization, not a government organization, or we'd say in today's world a non-GAO. And Don Quijos, see, I told you there was another Don in this conversation. that paraphrase that you talked about came from one of Kehoe's books. And I find it astonishing that the Air Force investigator, Barth, didn't talk to him as well to get another eyewitness perspective. Even though the two guys were together in the pickup truck, they're still going to have a somewhat different perspective. And while Saucedo is under the truck protecting himself, his passenger is sitting there staring at the thing, and he sees it go from this bright blue to this cherry red, this bright orange color before it takes off. So you've got some very good information there, but you don't have the kind of investigation you would expect. And I see this throughout the entire investigation of this whole series of sightings, not only in Levelland, but there was a series of sightings that started about 3 hours later at the White Sands Missile Range. At the time, I think it was White Sands Proving Grounds, where MPs encountered something as well. Two separate groups of MPs did. The Air Force only interviewed three of them, didn't interview the fourth, and the excuse was, well, the fourth guy was on a 3-day pass. And I'm thinking, this makes no sense to me. As a former military officer, I understand the workings of a 3-day pass, and you are limited into your travel. Means you can only go so far from the base on your 3-day pass because they don't want you getting overly tired and getting involved in a traffic accident. Yeah. And you have to be available for recall if you're needed. So, well, you have the Air Force investigation going on. They could have recalled the guy, so he could have come on. I think his name was Wilbanks, by the way. I think it was Wilbanks, and they could have interviewed him as well as his partner, Glenn Toy, who I did talk to, and the other two MPs that saw something later. The Air Force, of course, wrote it off as the first MPs saw the moon, and you have to remember that they claimed it came down within 50 feet of the ground, and so it would have been silhouetted against the background of the mountain. So it was clearly below the horizon. The moon, I don't know of any instances where you see the moon below the horizon like that. Yeah. And then the later sighting by another group of MPs was labeled as Venus, and the Air Force did a nice job of smearing these guys' reputation, talking about where they were young, they were poorly educated, they got caught up in the hysteria of the moment. And while you might be able to say it to the second group of MPs, the first two, Toy and Wilbanks, couldn't have been caught up in the hysteria of the moment because we're talking 1957. There is no social media. You can't post it to Facebook. You can't put up a TikTok. You can't talk about it on Instagram because it doesn't exist. And the news media didn't get the reports out till the next day. So there was no way for the first MPs to have heard anything about flying saucers in the Levelland, Texas area. White Sands is probably 4.5 hours by car from Levelland. The other group of MPs, of course, heard about the sightings that the first two MPs had seen. So you could say, well, they were caught up in hysteria, but the other two you can't. And the one thing if you go through and you read the reports, and they say, well, they were well dressed, their uniforms were immaculate, they participated in the military protocols properly, but they were young. And they were impressionable, and you just really can't trust what they had to say. They were 20 and 21 years old. And I think back to my experiences in the military. At 19, I was a helicopter pilot in Vietnam and an aircraft commander. So I'm responsible for the aircraft. I'm responsible for my crew. I'm responsible for any passengers we carry. I'm responsible for all these sort of things, and I'm 19 years old. These guys were older than me. The guy we had in our unit, the guys who flew most of the time, we called one guy Papa because he was the oldest pilot other than the commanding officers and the upper levels of the chain of command. We called him Papa because he was so old. He was 23. So, they're belittling the MP's observations simply because they were young and impressionable. And of course, the Air Force also said that in the letters you see that we were able to retrieve through the Project Blue Book files, the Air Force is saying, well, they don't want to issue a statement until they hear what NICAP has to say. So NICAP comes out and talks about 9 witnesses or witnesses at 9 separate locations. And the Air Force response was, well, only 3 of the people saw an object. Well, if you go through the Project Blue Book files, you can find the names of 5 people who saw the object. And if you go through all the other material, I found names of people at 13 separate locations. And then we have the sheriff talking about, yes, we got dozens of phone calls. So there were lots and lots of witnesses. But there was little effort to find those additional witnesses, and the Air Force response was, well, we got this guy, Pedro Saucedo. He's a part-time barber. He's a farmhand, kind of an itinerant guy. I'm thinking he's a veteran of the Korean War, for crying out loud. Cut him some slack there. And I think I hesitate to say, I think there was kind of a racial aspect to it as well, because obviously he was a Mexican American. I mean, he was a citizen of the United States. He hadn't crossed the border or anything like that. He was born in the United States and was a veteran of the U.S. Army. So I cut the guy some slack there. But I think there was an element of racism there in the way he was treated or way his report was dismissed, among other things. But then we get all these other people involved as well. And now we're looking at something that is much more complex. And had we only had Pedro Saucedo, we can probably dismiss the case. And in fact, the Air Force said, well, his truck had just been repaired the day before. And as it was examined after the sighting, we found a piece of metal in the rotator on the distributor, which may have caused it to short out. And I'm thinking, yeah, it shorted out only when the UFO was nearby, and then it worked perfectly all other times. Not sure that explanation works. Hynek pointed out that they only had two other cases where the engine stalled that he knew of. He's talking again of the three witnesses, and he said, you can eliminate Saucedo because of the problem with the distributor. There was mist in the area, and if anybody who's ever owned an MG knows that if it rains, well, it used to be this way in the 1960s. If it rained, the fuel pump stopped working, and you had to bang on it or push a reset switch to get the car to work again. So they're kind of pulling this sort of an explanation out of their hip pocket, saying, well, the car stalled out because of the mist. No mist in the area, no rain in the area. The rain had gone through earlier in the day, and the sky was virtually clear, and there was no rain. And Hynek pointed out, well, the more witnesses you have, the more unlikely the explanation that the single explanation of the rain affecting the engines of the cars and the one with Saucedo, the bigger the coincidence, the less likely it is it's got some kind of an easy answer. Hynek realized that at the time, but I think Hynek was operating with what he got from the Air Force, which was, well, there were only three people who saw the object, implying there were only three instances of the car stalling out. I don't think Hynek was aware when he reviewed the files in 1957 that there were so many other witnesses involved in that as well. Now, and not only that, the sheriff's widow told Don Burlinson there had been a burned area north of town. And Burlinson went out and talked to the rancher, actually the rancher's widow, because the rancher had since died, as had the sheriff. I guess I mentioned his wife was a widow. But the daughter had gone out with her father and seen the burned area. So we do have a firsthand witness to the burned area. It's not secondhand there. And I'm thinking now, if you have the cars being stalled, which is an interaction with the environment, you have a landing trace, which is indirect physical evidence. You have Air Force officers involved. You've got one hell of a case going on here if it was properly investigated in 1957. But in 1957, the Air Force had no interest in doing that. They wanted to explain cases and move on. And you can see that in the documentation from the Project Blue Book files, what their real motive was and what they were doing there. So we've got a very solid case there. I think the next day, being November 3rd, the Sunday after the sightings, the provost marshal from Reese Air Force Base, and the provost marshal would be like the chief of police. Yeah. But he's for the base. For those of you who don't know what a provost marshal is, he went out with the sheriff, and they were looking for a landing trace. And they went to a couple places where the witnesses had said it was on the ground, but I don't think they got far enough north and realized that this rancher was involved at that time. But they were out looking for landing traces. We also know, based on this, that the sheriff changed his story from the first reports he made about seeing the oval-shaped object and all of that sort of thing. When he was interviewed by the Air Force NCO, Sergeant Barth, his statement is a little bit different about seeing the streak of light for maybe 2 seconds in the distance. So he's still seeing something, but it's far off, and it's only for a short period of time. And we're not aware of everybody else who was involved in that sighting at that time. And then we come back to the idea that the sheriff talked about the object. But in the interim, apparently an FBI agent talked to the sheriff. And when Barth got in to interview the sheriff, I think they agreed on the statement, not necessarily what he'd actually seen, but what could be said that wouldn't, I guess, inflame the investigators by saying, well, I just saw it in the distance, I didn't see anything. And then once he was out of that influence, Don Berliner, I think, interviewed him in 1973, 1974. So it's quite a ways after the case is going on. But he's back to, he saw the object much closer, and it was an object as opposed to a streak of light. So we can see the influence of the government on that, and the manipulation of the data by the Air Force at the time, and the way they manipulated the case study so it didn't sound as important as it was. But I think in one respect, it's a little bit better than the Roswell case simply because of the electromagnetic effects and the continuation of the sightings in white sands and that sort of thing. I think it makes it a little bit better. Roswell, if we could get our hands on the official reports, if we could see the bodies, if we could see the crashed craft, well, then Roswell, of course, is the penultimate, that we've now solved this situation. We understand, we know for a fact that there's alien visitation. Levelland leads us in that direction, as does Roswell. But I think Levelland is a very important case because of the number of witnesses and the interactions with the environment.
Yeah, I think there's so much going on with it, Kevin, as well, because if you take the official explanation, it's pretty, they can explain it away very simply. And I think when you look at some of the reports, because I think aren't there two witnesses who are driving, sort of later on, whose cars die on them, and they get out of their cars to see a giant oval object in the middle of the road in front of them, which is, under any sort of explanation, I find that very hard to believe that anybody could mistake seeing Venus or the moon or ball lightning or whatever numerous explanations come forward. And I've also, and you may know more about this than perhaps I do, I also saw it wasn't just cars that seemed to be affected. I remember seeing a report once where a farmer had said his combine harvesters, or his grain combines, he had two of them, and they both broke down for a brief period of time as he saw a light go over him.
That took place in Pettit, Texas, which is a small town near Levelland. Small town. Levelland is a big town compared to Pettit.
Yes.
But yes, and that call, and he called into the sheriff, and it was the sheriff who made that report for us as well. So we did get that information. There were a number of people. One guy saw the amp meter on his car jumping to discharge and back again, and then all of a sudden the car stalled and he coasted to a stop near this glowing object sitting in the field, and he watched it for quite a long time. We've got people who got out of the car and started toward it, and the object lifts off. One of the misnomers that come out of these electromagnetic cases is that the idea the cars started spontaneously once the UFO was gone. And that was one of the reasons the Condon Committee being the University of Colorado study done in the late 1960s, paid for by the Air Force, with the conclusions written before the contracts were signed. And there's documentation for that, and I have it up on my blog. It's called the Hippler Letter, for those who would like to look it up. But the Hippler Letter explains what they want, and the Condon Committee writing back say, yeah, we can do that. and they did exactly that. They didn't look at Levelland at all, and one of the reasons they didn't, the Levelland is mentioned once in this massive thing, and the reason they said they didn't look at it was because they could think of no mechanism where you could stall a car engine using a magnetic field. And I think the evidence of other cases proves there's a massive magnetic field. And we talk about the electromagnetic pulse from atomic explosions that would stall your car as well and burn out your electronics. But they could think of no mechanism where if you remove that field, the car would restart spontaneously. And so I began looking at the cases with that in mind and going through Mark Roddiker's study, and he published that in 1985, and he had some 400 vehicle interference cases. And if you read them carefully, almost all of them suggest that the drivers took an action to start the car. And it would say things like the car, the car operated normally. after the object left. Or in some cases, it actually mentions the driver restarted the engine. In only one case in Levelland did the witness insist that the car started spontaneously. And I am pretty well convinced in reading the other cases that he started it. He just didn't remember doing it. He was one of those deals where you're trying to start the car and it won't start, and then suddenly it starts, and he got it in his head that it started spontaneously. But if the Condon Committee had bothered to look at the evidence and at least make a phone call or two, they would have discovered that just wasn't one of the things that came out of the Levelland case, with except that one exception, that the car started spontaneously. They looked at two cases of vehicle interference during their investigation. One of them, it sounds an awful lot like, and I kind of agree with the explanation, that the car was in poor operating condition.
Yeah.
And it really had very little to do with her sighting of a UFO. In the other case, though, you could maybe make a somewhat similar case, the car being in somewhat disrepair, but the problem is that if I remember correctly, the close approach of the UFO erased the audio tapes that were stored in the car, and that the window, it was a convertible, and the window, which in a lot of convertibles, the back window is not glass, but it's plastic, and it kind of became wavy. It wasn't a good solid piece of plastic in the rear after the UFO passed by. And of course the Condon Committee said, well, that could be a result of it sitting out in the sun too much, and the driver didn't really notice it. And there's something to that. I mean, you don't really notice that. There was a case in Washington State, a number of cases, about windshield pitting as a result of atomic explosions in the Pacific during the 50s. And all of a sudden there was this article published about it, and people started calling in and saying, my windshields are pitted. And I think what they concluded for those was, people don't look at the windshield, they look through it. Yeah. And it wasn't until somebody suggested there may be some windshield pitting going on here that people began looking for the windshield pits. And, oh yeah, my car was injured that way too, or my car was damaged that way too. Yeah. So there's something to be said for the guy hadn't noticed that, but there were other aspects of it that suggested this electromagnetic effect, but the Condon Committee just dismissed them both and went on. And that was all the investigation they did for the electromagnetic effects, with the vehicle interference. They looked at some other things. In the book, I talk about a couple of things where radio stations were knocked off the air by the close approach of a UFO. We have interference with television signals. We have cases of power outages that seem to be related to UFO sightings and that sort of thing. And of course, there's a number of cases in which animals react to the close approach of the UFO, which suggests some kind of radiation that they detect that we as humans may not be able to detect, but they react to that as well. So we have this wide body of evidence for these electromagnetic effects. Granted, not all UFO close approaches result in a report of an electromagnetic effect, but there's a substantial number of them that do. It's a small part of small subset of the whole UFO phenomenon. In France in 1954, there were an awful lot of cases of similar type things going on, but in a lot of the French cases, they would see beings outside the craft. And in one case, the guy was walking toward the beings, and one of them flashed something at him, and he felt paralyzed. He couldn't move. And they scampered back into the UFO and took off. And the thing had landed on a railroad bed. The police investigated and determined, based on the impressions left behind, that the object weighed 30 tons. So we've got a guy who sees the UFO, he sees the beings, there's a electromagnetic effect of some kind in relation to it, and there are physical traces left behind. So we've got a large body of very interesting information, and I think the French did a better job of investigating those cases in 1954 than the American Air Force did investigating the Levelland cases in 1957. But the American investigation had an agenda, which was to debunk UFOs, take the mystery from UFOs, and people would lose their interest in it. Well, that didn't work out real well, because here we are in 2022 and we're still interested in UFOs.
Very true. And I think it's a very interesting aspect of the whole phenomenon when we look at the reaction of certain cars at certain periods. I think often, Kevin, people would consider it to be a media cliche that whenever we watch a drama or a film about a UFO encounter, often the person that's about to have the encounter, they'll be driving somewhere and then their car will stop. And yet, I think it's one of those that unless you really dive into the subject, you may suspect that maybe one or two cases that have that effect. But I think, and you've got a phenomenal list in the book, that there are hundreds of cases where this has happened to varying degrees. Like you say, it's not always the car stops, but the radio changes. I remember the Alan Godfrey case in Todmorden in 1980. When he encounters it, he tries to use both his radios, the car radio and his walkie-talkie that he has. Neither will respond, and they're both full of static. We've got cases from Wales in the 70s where people's cars die and then they try them 10, 15, 20 seconds later. Kevin, they start straight up. It happened in some cases in Scotland in the 90s as well. So it's not just, these cases that are going on in the USA. I think if you look into a wide body of UFO reports and witness encounters across the world, you will find a large body of evidence that supports that in some aspects of these interactions, certain vehicles or certain craft create some kind of electromagnetic interference, for whatever reason it may be.
Well, I should point out that the first reported case of vehicle interference by a UFO took place in England in 1909.
Yeah, Norfolk, wasn't it?
Yes, and a fellow on his motorcycle saw a glowing ball in a field, and the headlight of his motorcycle went out. And once the object left or the ball disappeared, the headlight began to operate. I've got a long list in the book, as you mentioned, but it is not a complete list. And there were cases that I just ignored because there wasn't enough information about them to include them in the list. It was just, somebody had saw something car stalled. Well, I need more information than that. But there are, Roddicker in his book has a long list of those. A guy named Eric Herr and I think Fran Ridge were looking for cases of compass interference. And we go back to the Kenneth Arnold sighting from June of 1947. He was the pilot that kind of started the thing here in the United States with flying saucers. Not long after his sighting, and what I'm saying is minutes after his sighting, a prospector in Washington State named Fred Johnson saw objects flying over him, and his compass began to spin. And so here we have a direct evidence of electromagnetic effect, being it's magnetic because the compass spin. And as I said, Eric Herr and Fran Ridge collected, I think, 170 cases of compass interference. And I have some of them. I've listed some of them in the book, but there's those sorts of things that take us to the electromagnetic aspect of it because of the way the instrumentation responds. So yeah, and you're right. It doesn't always suppress the car engine, but it does have effects on the radios or other electronics in the car. And we've seen that in sightings where people will see something or hear something and they look outside and they see the object and their television is filled with static or goes off. And once the object leaves, then the static leaves with it. One of the things I've been looking into, and I think I'm not the only one, because as I began to look into it, I found other people interested in this, people attempting to video UFOs with their cell phones, and the camera fails to work. And in some of the cases, they say, well, we got the audio, the people talking about it, but the video failed us. And so the information you need from that point on, was the object large enough to be seen on the video cameras in the phone, or was it or was it so far away that the camera just couldn't pick it up, given the capabilities of some of the cameras? I know of some cases where the object was truly large enough for the camera to pick it up, and it didn't do that. So we have all these sorts of things going on in this aspect of the UFO phenomenon. And I think it's been talked about by some researchers to some extent. As I said, Mark Roddicker did his vehicle interference case. And it just sprung into my mind, there are 4 cases, and I just love this, 4 cases where the car's paint changed color, not necessarily all at once of the whole car, but some of them did. The whole car changed color. And in one of the cases, the guy went home, and I can't remember, his car was gray and it turned green, or it was green and turned gray. But either way, he got home and his wife wanted to know if he bought a new car. because the car was a different color. And somebody pointed out to me just the other day, and I missed it completely, Barney and Betty Hill had that sort of a phenomenon. When they checked their car trunk after their encounter with the UFO, there were some spots on the trunk that they couldn't. It wasn't like you got tree sap on your car or something like that. It was something that changed the color of the paint on the car in a couple of spots. So that would make a fifth case that I hadn't even thought about when I was putting together the list. But I just love the idea that it changes the color of your car. Not necessarily the whole car, but in a couple of cases, certainly.
Fantastic. Well, that is very interesting. I think the other aspect of this is, Kevin, as well, when we're talking about what happened at Levelland and then the following day at White Sands, there is a third sort of wave or flap that happens, I believe, in a place called Oro Grande. And I find it interesting that as we start to look backwards at certain cases, I think often we can look at things in isolation. And I think a lot of people and a lot of researchers have started to begin to look around incidents, because often I think the established sort of version of these events these are incidents in isolation. It's seen by 1, 2, 3 people. Nothing's happened. And I think as more and more news databases are uploaded onto the internet, it's giving people a wider scope of information to use as a resource, because often, especially in the US, Kevin, you have vast expanses of the country where, with the greatest respect, I wouldn't expect you to be flying from state to state to try and get into their local archives to look at their newspaper archive. Whereas now, a lot of people can just have an online account and you can access a vast pool of resource that you would probably never been able to access up until about 10 years ago.
Not only that, I've got a complete set of the MUFON journals digitally. I have a complete set of the Project Blue Book files digitally. I have APRO bulletins, the NICAP UFO Investigator, and a lot of magazines. Isaac Coy has been gathering this material for a long time and scanning it and making it available online as well. And every 2 or 3 days, there's another great compendium of material put online by him. CUFOS, Center for UFO Studies, has a project where they're working on scanning all their material and getting it up online. So yeah, you can do that sort of thing. You mentioned Oro Grande, and I have to point out here, Oro Grande, the sighting there took place just a couple of days after the Socorro or the Levelland sightings, so it's in the same time frame. Oro Grande is a small town between Alamogordo and El Paso, Texas, and of course we had and right by the White Sands Missile Range. In fact, if you drive from Alamogordo to El Paso, you pass the White Sands Missile Range main gate area, and you drive through Oro Grande, which I think is Spanish for big gold. But a fellow named James Stokes was heading toward El Paso and had his radio begin to fade out, and then the engine stalled, and he pulled to the side of the road, and there were 6 or 7 cars in front of him, people standing outside, and they were watching an object fly over a couple of times. It made a couple of passes over their cars, and then it disappeared. Stokes then, I don't know if he went to El Paso. El Paso's, an hour and a half from Alamogordo, something like that. And when he got back to Alamogordo, his car, of course, he got his car started, of course. When he got to Alamogordo, he called his boss at Holloman Air Force Base and said, "Can I talk about this UFO sighting?" And the boss says, "Were you on duty when it happened?" And he said, "No." And the boss said, "I don't care." So Stokes called his friend Jim Lorenzen, who was one of the directors of the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, APRO, which was headquartered in Alamogordo at the time. And when he showed up, he had a sunburn effect on part of his face and one of his arms. Think Richard Dreyfuss in Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
Yeah.
I think that's where that came from, as a matter of fact. It was a very light sunburn, and it disappeared in a matter of hours, but the Lorenzen saw it and reported it. And Stokes was taken to the local radio station there and talked to the news director, guy named Clark, who also witnessed the light sunburn. By the time the Air Force investigator showed up to talk to people, the sunburn had faded and there was no evidence of it. But I think it's important that there was another effect, and you mentioned Oro Grande, and I think it's important that people understand that we had Levelland on the 2nd of November to the 3rd of November, over the midnight hour. The next morning, which is November 3rd, maybe 2 hours, 3 hours after all of the sightings in Levelland that took place in the White Sands Missile Range. And then we go a couple of days later and we have another sighting right in that very area doing the same thing, stalling car engines. So it's just not an isolated event in Levelland, but there's a number of other events that take place around that area in that time frame. And then we look back at the rest of the country and we get some of the same thing in other locations around the United States, but an awful concentration of those in West Texas, Texas Panhandle, and New Mexico.
Yeah, I know often people try and dismiss it and say that they're different things, but I know you refer to that I think, do a couple of the witnesses describe the object as being torpedo shaped, whereas the majority say it's sort of oval shaped. But once again, I suppose that's the perception of where you're seeing something from, is it not, Kevin?
What I think, I don't think it was changing shape. They talked about it being egg shaped as well. And I think if, you look at those old big propane tanks or a tank car, a railroad tank car, and you look at it straight on and it's going to look like a big torpedo-shaped object. If you look at it from an angle, it's going to have more of a distorted egg shape type. And if you look at it from one end, it's going to be circular. It hasn't changed shape. It's just this is where you were standing when you perceived the object, where you saw the object. So you're talking about what you've seen, but the changing shape really has nothing to do with the object changing shape. It's a matter of perspective. So when people talked about it being torpedo-shaped, I think they got a look at it from a different angle than those who talked about it being more egg-shaped or something like that, especially when it's surrounded by a very bright, intense light. And you mentioned Saucedo's passenger being unable to look directly at it because it was so bright. So you're going to get a faulty impression from the object in that environment as well, because it's difficult to see it behind the bright light.
I mean, how many of the witnesses had the typical response of having their characters assassinated, Kevin? Because often we see a lot of the 50s, and I know as we refer to Saucedo, people would kind of look towards him as not a very credible person because of his employment and his ethnicity, and the fact that he would have been classed as being, of low intelligence and not sort of educationally up to standard when it came to the US Air Force taking somebody seriously, which when you look at a lot of cases, they will often try and dismiss it, as we said about the personnel. Well, they were young guys. What do they know? They were hysterical. They're overexcitable. And you see this time and time again. If it's children or women in that certain era or people from different backgrounds, Kevin, they will be very dismissive of these people's ability to give you a coherent report.
You're absolutely right. I think back to the photographs taken by a fellow named William Rhodes in 1947. I mean, within a couple of weeks of Arnold's sighting. And interestingly, Arnold talked to a couple of Air Force intelligence officers, and they mentioned the Rhodes photograph and how it looked similar to what Arnold had reported. But they made a big deal about him. Well, he's kind of a pompous guy, and he calls himself the director of the panoramic labs. and of course the panoramic lab is in his backyard, but apparently it's a fully stocked scientific lab. The guy turns out was a pretty smart guy. He held a number of patents. They said, well, he lives off his wife's income as a teacher. He may have been living off his income from his patents, for crying out loud. I talked to a guy, Manal, I think his name was, and they were having a problem at Arizona State University with getting some of their equipment to work properly. So Manal calls in Rhodes to look at it, and Rhodes fixes the problem. And they were trying to get him on the staff at Arizona State University, but Rhodes was kind of an arrogant guy, and his real specialty was solving problems. He loved to solve problems, but once the problem was solved, he just really didn't have time for it anymore, and he didn't want to have that be locked down that way. At one point at the beginning of the Second World War, he was employed by the Navy, and they gave him the equivalency of a PhD. And what happened was the Navy realized that there was not enough PhDs on their payroll, so they designed a series of tests. And if you passed at a certain level, you would be the equivalency of a bachelor's degree. If you passed at a higher level, you get a master's degree. And if you passed at the top level, you got the equivalency of a PhD. So he earned that as well. But the Air Force made him out to be an arrogant, dumb guy who probably faked the photographs. And you see this time and again where their assessment of a witness suggests that the witness is not a credible source. And so we can dismiss the case because the person wasn't credible. And I think that's a flaw in their investigation. I think we need to look at the information. Sure, in the Roswell case, we believed a number of people up front because they seemed to be authentic and they seemed to be real. And we have since learned that they were not credible witnesses, but we exposed them as soon as we learned the truth. The Air Force goes in with the attitude that these people are not credible, and we're going to do everything we can to belittle their sightings. And in some cases, they stumble badly, like with Levelland, where they say, well, it was ball lightning these people saw. No, it wasn't ball lightning. I'm sorry.
I mean, as we were talking before we started the interview proper, Kevin, I'm still amazed that when it comes to official explanations, ball lightning often gets put forward. And yet there is no real scientific evidence that proves ball lightning. There are people that have been arguing about this for nearly 200 years, since I think it was first put forward in sort of the mid-19th century by a British physicist. And yet, I think it's one of those explanations that has very little evidence that it exists, and it certainly doesn't act in the way that officialdom would like the general public to believe it does, Kevin. I find it remarkable that people will accept it as an explanation, despite the body of evidence for it even existing as a scientific phenomenon to be minimal at best.
We have the same problem with the Roswell case, with the exception of the Project Mogul explanation. You have to wonder how these officers at the Roswell Army Airfield were so dumb they couldn't recognize weather balloons and Ray 1 radar detectors when they saw them, even if they were strung together in a big array. The real stumbling point there is the flight they mention as the culprit, flight number 4 in Mogul. We have the field notes and the diary of Dr. Albert Crary, who was the leader of the project in New Mexico. It wasn't classified as the Air Force would like you to believe. What they were doing in New Mexico was not classified. They were using off-the-shelf equipment. There were pictures of Project Mogul array in the newspapers on July 10th, 1947, so it wasn't a very highly classified project, but they tried to give us the idea it was so highly classified that the officers at Roswell may not have recognized the equipment. Well, they would have recognized the equipment. Sheridan Cavett, who was interviewed by the Air Force investigation, said when he got out to the debris field that Mac Brazel took them to, him and Jesse Marcel, he said he recognized it immediately as the remains of a weather balloon. And I'm thinking, well, then why didn't you mention this rather important piece of evidence to Jesse Marcel and the commanding officer in Roswell, Colonel Blanchard? Say, well, it's nothing but a weather balloon. And rather than allowing them to issue the press release, we have a flying saucer and we're flying the remains to Fort Worth for examination. The other problem we have with that explanation is, according to everything that I can find, Brazel brought samples of the material into the sheriff's office when he reported to the sheriff on Sunday afternoon. And if Sheridan Cavett could recognize the balloon in the field, why couldn't he recognize it in the sheriff's office when he saw it? So there's a real problem there. But people are more convinced today than they were when the Air Force made the announcement back in the mid-1990s that it was Project Mogul and weather balloon. People say, well, it was just proven to be a weather balloon. No, it wasn't. It wasn't part of Project Mogul. It was a balloon project in New Mexico run by the University of New York University, NYU. And it was not classified. What they were doing was out in the open. Everybody knew it. And some of the balloons arrays were recovered by them and some of them were not. But flight number 4, according to the documentation, did not fly. It was canceled because the arrays were considered a hazard to aerial navigation. The arrays in the East Coast, when they first started them, were like 600 feet long, but by the time they got to New Mexico, they were only about 400 feet long, but they were still considered a hazard to aerial navigation, and they were required to put out NOTAMs that were going to be flying these things, and they couldn't fly them at night, and they couldn't fly them in cloudy weather, because at night you couldn't see them, and in cloudy weather you couldn't see them. Yeah. You'd fly into them. So the June 4th, 1947 flight number 4 was canceled. And it says, all right, the daughter canceled the flight today because of clouds. And yet we have people believing today, yes, it was Project Mogul. There is no terrestrial explanation for Roswell. There is no terrestrial explanation for Levelland.
Do you think these cases are the tip of the iceberg? Because often, as we touched on there, Kevin, everybody knows about Roswell who's a passing interest in ufology. Levelland's one of those I think you have to be to a certain level of interest in the subject. Do you think there are other cases of that era that, when we look back at it with a hard gaze and a proper slant of investigation, that more of these cases will come forwards where we've got multiple witnesses, various interactions, numerous responses, both physically and through electronic responses to whatever's happening, and Levelland is simply the tip of an iceberg that we have yet to uncover, really?
You have to remember, nobody was talking about Roswell until 1978, when Jesse Marcel began telling people about having picked up pieces of a flying saucer. Nobody's talking about, if you mentioned Roswell, nobody knew what you meant. Frank Edwards in 1966 in his book, Flying Saucers, Serious Business, does 2 paragraphs on Roswell. The only information he got right in that whole thing was Roswell, New Mexico. He talked about how the farmer saw the object explode in the air, and the Air Force explained it was a kite with a pie plate dangling beneath it. Well, none of that is right. Mac Brazel couldn't have seen it explode in the air because his ranch house was 10 or 15 miles from the debris field. The Air Force explanation was a weather balloon, and the pictures were there for anybody to see who wanted it. It was labeled as a hoax if it was mentioned basically at all, other than what Frank Edwards wrote. And there wasn't enough information to get any kind of footing there. It didn't give you a year. All it said was Roswell, New Mexico, and a rancher. I mean, how do you begin that? Where do you start? And it's only because Jess Marcel was talking about it that people began to look at it, because they had a starting point. Well, it would have been July of 1947, Jess Marcel, and suddenly you're looking at newspapers from 1947. There's a picture of Jess Marcel on the front pages with the weather balloon. Well, now we've got a place to start. We know it's Roswell, New Mexico. We know it's July of 1947. And then you learn that they created a yearbook from the airbase in 1947. So now we've got a listing of 1,500 people who were assigned there, and we can begin talking to those people, and we can talk to the sheriff's department. We had a place to begin. So yes, there's got to be cases out there where there's 1 or 2 little pieces of information floating around, and people are just saying, well, that's interesting. We need something a little bit more to begin the investigation. But I mean, Roswell comes out of that kind of an environment. Levelland people were talking about a little bit, but not much. The Lubbock Lights from 1951 with the photographs taken by Carl Hart Jr. And the Air Force wrote it off as birds, which of course is untrue as well. Because there was no way that Hart could have photographed birds, which means the photographs have to be fake, Yeah. I talked to Carl Hart, which is really kind of funny. I was in Lubbock, Texas, because the research led us to the University, Texas Tech University, because that's where the notes of one of these archaeologists was hidden or stored. And I was going through those, and in the hotel room that night, I just on a lark picked up the phone book and looked up Carl Hart. By God, he was in the phone book, so I called him. And we chatted about it, and I said to him, "What'd you photograph?" He says, "I still don't know." And I'm thinking, the teenagers who have photographed UFOs, for the most part, when they're faked, eventually come out and tell everybody, well, I faked that. But here we are now. I talked to him, 45 years after the fact. Now he's a guy in his 60s. Yeah. And he said, I still don't know what I photographed. So, I mean, there's another big case, the Lubbock Lights case, and we have the Phoenix Lights, and we have Chicago O'Hare, where there's multiple witnesses and some very interesting information. The cases are out there. It's just a question of stumbling across the right information to get you started on it.
Absolutely. I think that's one of it's both tantalizing and frustrating, Kevin, that you have so much official misinformation out there. And as you mentioned there about some of the early reports about Roswell, they're just factually incorrect on every level other than where it happened.
But you can't blame the news media for Roswell, because there really was no place for them to go. Yeah. They get to Roswell and Marcel's not there. The stuff is taken to Fort Worth, and General Ramey, the higher headquarters, is saying, well, here's the weather balloon. And they're saying, yeah, okay. And they're talking to Ramey, and they're talking to the people involved there, and bringing the weather officer. And he says, yeah, that's a weather balloon and a Ray 1 target. and you can't talk to anybody else because where's Mac Brazel? Well, he's back at his ranch or being held incommunicado on the base, either way. But his ranch has no telephone, so you can't call him up. You can't find him. Can't find Marcel because he's not in Roswell anymore. He's in Fort Worth. And the Air Force is saying, well, here's what they brought, and it's just a weather balloon, and there's no place to go. And it's not until Marcel started talking and we began to look a lot closer at the case that we realized there was a lot more to it. When Don Schmidt and I, another Don in this conversation, by the way.
Yes.
When Don Schmidt and I went to investigate the Roswell case the first time, we expected to find the explanation immediately because it's a weather balloon, you know.
Yeah.
And the first part of our investigation, we're going to talk to Frank Joyce, one of the reporters from Roswell in 1947. He begged off on the interview because he was ill, so that didn't pan out. We went to meet with a group of UFO people, and it turns out they were way new agey and doing all kinds of bizarre things that had nothing to do with UFOs, so they were no help. We went and talked to Cliff Stone, and he knew a lot about UFOs, but nothing that neither Don nor I needed to know because, A, we already knew most of this stuff, and he drew conclusions that were not supported by the documentation. And the first thing he did, once we got there, we followed him to his house. We get sent in the living room, and he says, oh, I got to go out to the car. And he comes back in, and he's carrying a document with a top secret cover sheet on it. And as he goes into another room, I said to Don, well, if he doesn't have a vault in that room, he's going to jail. Top secret material requires a vault. You can't put it in a safe. You have to put it in a vault.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that was a stage dressing. I mean, he was, here's how important I have. I have top secret documents I carry around in my car. No, you don't. So that blew up. And then we went to talk to Bill Brazel, the son of the man who had found the stuff and started the whole thing. And that turned it around because we got very good information from him, very credible source. We got names, we got descriptions of the debris and all of that kind of stuff. And as we were leaving New Mexico, I said to Don, we've got to come back. We're not done. And that launched dozens of trips to New Mexico and talking to dozens of witnesses, some of them who blew up, and others who are very, very credible. I think specifically of Edwin Easley, who was the provost marshal at Roswell in 1947. And I asked him at one point, he was very cagey what he said to us because he'd taken an oath not to talk about it. And I would ask him questions, well, I can't tell you that, I was sworn to secrecy type thing. So I finally asked him one day, I said, are we following the right path? And he says, what do you mean? I said, we think it's extraterrestrial. And he said, well, let me put it this way. It's not the wrong path. So now we have a top officer on Ramey's staff telling us it's extraterrestrial to join Jesse Marcel, who's suggesting it's extraterrestrial. So, you've got to have a starting place for the investigation. You've got to have a way of doing it. You have to have a way of vetting the witnesses. All much easier in today's world with the internet. You can plug a guy's name in there and you have to be careful. You get the right guy. I got accused once when I was an officer in the National Guard of having a DUI, driving under the influence.
Yeah.
And turned out the guy had the same name as I did. And fortunately, he lived in Florida.
Yes.
And fortunately, while he was busy driving drunk, I was deployed to Iraq. So I said, I wasn't even in the country at the time. You can check. Talk to everybody who saw me on a daily basis in Iraq while he was drunk driving. But so you have to be careful. We ran into trouble getting a guy security clearance because we had a guy who had the same name and same birth date as a fellow who was a convict. They had different social security numbers, but it caused us a lot of aggravation because the guy had been in jail. The exact same name, including the middle initial and the same birth date. Oh. And we had to prove it's not the same guy. And we had to finally deploy with the guy without having a security clearance. We finally cleared it up while we were in Iraq, but we couldn't get it finished while we were doing that sort of work here before we deployed. So, I mean, you have to make sure you got the right guy when you start slinging some of the allegations around, too. You have to vet it very carefully. And it can be done in today's environment.
Absolutely. And I think the last thing I want to touch on before I let you go, Kevin, is obviously, as you touched on there in regards to Roswell, I believe your next book is focusing on Roswell, because I find it incredible, as you say, that here we are, 2022, and we're about to hit the 75th anniversary, which is remarkable when you think about how long we've been trying to chase down this story and find out what really happened.
The chase didn't really begin until 1978, so we have to remember that.
Yeah.
And Don and I didn't really get started until 1988, so we were 10 years later coming to the party, so to speak. But now, right, we're at 75 years, and the witnesses basically are all gone now. We may find one or two lower-ranking enlisted soldiers who are in their late 90s. I talked to a guy, good Lord, close to 10 years ago, and he was 89 when I talked to him, and he was one of the lower-ranking enlisted soldiers of Roswell. Talked to him about what he had seen. So, it's been 75 years. Had it not crashed near Roswell, and had the government, the military, not been able to suppress the data as easily as they did, we'd be having a different conversation. But it was just so well stage managed by the military once they got their act together that it disappeared from ufological discussion for 30 some years.
I think it is remarkable. I think the earliest thing I can remember seeing Jesse Marcel discussing it was on an episode of In Search Of, which I think was sort of 79, 80, Kevin. And I think if anybody gets the chance to watch that episode again, because it was one of the later ones as well, it was towards the end of that series, finishing, when Jesse Marcel's on it, there is something rather haunting about that whole episode and how he is and how he's talking about it. He seems like a man that's haunted by something that he'd had to hold in, because I believe he just basically thought he'd had enough, because he was suffering from some health problems towards the end of his life, wasn't he? And I think he just thought, I can't live with this anymore. I'm
not sure the motivation for Jesse Marcel coming out and telling the story, but thank God he did. But yeah, it was toward the end of his life that he began talking about. Now, the other side of the coin is Edwin Easley would help us as much as he could when he wasn't afraid of violating his oath, and mentioned to family as he was dying of cancer. I think one of the daughters bought a copy of the book Don Schmidt and I had written, UFO Crash at Roswell, and brought it in, and his response was, "Oh, the creatures." And so, there's a little bit additional secondhand information. Easily wouldn't answer questions about that for me, but of course I talked to him when he was in better health, and I think he was still living with his oath. And the impression I always got from Easley is he wanted to tell us everything. He just didn't feel he could. He wanted to maintain the oath he'd taken, but he didn't answer the questions. And if I could ask it in a roundabout enough way, I could get some good information from him. But we have to take a look at all of that, and we've lost all of those people now that we don't have an opportunity to go back and gather additional information from them. I know Don and Tom Carey did an awful lot of work in the mid 1990s and later gathering a lot of additional information from witnesses. So we do have a wide body of information about that case.
Absolutely, yeah. I've had the pleasure of speaking with Tom about that, and it's remarkable the nuggets that still can appear sometimes, Kevin, when you think something's done and dusted, something else just appears from out of nowhere, and then all of a sudden you've got new leads.
And you have to be careful of those new leads, because sometimes they don't work out real well, and some of them are very good. Yeah. But we've run into a lot of people who've tried to inject themselves into the Roswell case, and I like to tell the story that at the turn of the century, that would be the 19th century into the 20th century, in the United States, there were 15 guys in various carnivals and sideshows and circuses claiming to be the real Jesse James. Yes. Well, 14 of them had to be lying. And it's pretty good case the 15th was too.
Yeah.
But I mean, here were the guys, they made their living by pretending to be Jesse James. And we can look back at a lot of events where people inject themselves into it when they clearly were not there.
Absolutely. I think, Roswell is not the only case in UFO history where we've got characters interjecting and placing themselves front and centre, Kevin, who have absolutely nothing to do with it, or have even used other people's statements and trying to pass them off as their own.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing with investigation. If you're doing preparing for a debate, that's one thing. But if you're doing actual investigation, you have to ask all the questions and you have to get all the information and you have to vet that information carefully to make sure that you're not being led down the wrong path or the person isn't being as candid with you as he or she could be.
Absolutely. Well, Kevin, it's been a real pleasure speaking with you about Levelland and other cases, as well as Roswell, on top of everything else. And I want to thank you for your time and your conversation. Where can everybody get hold of a copy of your latest book and also follow your work online?
Well, first of all, the book is available on Amazon.com, obviously, under Kevin Randle. It's called Levelland, for those of you interested. There's also my many other UFO books available at Amazon. The blog is www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com, and there's additional information there. And there's on the left side, there's a listing of some of the later books. You can click on that, and that'll take you to Amazon as well. And so you can see that. The blog goes back to like 2007. And so there's a lot of information there that I've even forgotten now. I was looking something else up the other day, and my blog came up as one of the first entries on Google. And I said, I don't remember this. Went to it. Oh, yeah, I know I remember that. So there's a lot of good information there. But again, you have to follow the progress of some of the cases to see where it ends up. I do something on the blog periodically called Chasing Footnotes, where somebody talks about a case and there's a footnote and it references something else. So I go to that other source and look it up, and they reference something else, and I chase it to the very end to see what the ultimate story is there. And sometimes it doesn't turn out to be anything like what was published in that source that began the chase. So that's it, www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com. And like I said, everything is available under Kevin Randle at Amazon.
Fabulous. Well, I'll put links to the show notes, as I do for everyone and all my guests, Kevin. And I want to thank you once again for your polite conversation and deeply interesting thoughts on all these cases. It's been a real pleasure to finally get a chance to speak to you, and hopefully I'll get a chance to speak to you again sometime.
Well, you have my address now, so you can give me a shout whenever you need to.
Oh, very kind. You take care, Kevin.
You too. Thank you very much.